A Snake Pit of 30-06 Springfield. Written by Aaron Weinstock and read by John R. Wilhelm III. Creak, creak, said the alien known to Broderans and humans as Nimoy. The floating peak sphere, with ever-changing facial features and limbs, spoke to its trusted robot companion, Unit-059. The robot, then doing as ordered, broke open the door to the main cabin of the Chronoskimmer saucer rocket ship. Surprising those manning its flight controls, knowing an attack like this might come, our hero, K. Shinnick, ready for action, fired his... a blimp of static. Looking up from the newspaper he'd been reading, while at the same time he's been paying attention to the radio program, Patrick wondered what had happened until the station's news announcer spoke up. Breaking news! Another tremor just rocked Lexington Avenue and 2nd Avenue. While no one, as of yet, has been reported suffering injuries from these shakes, building supers are concerned for their establishments and wondering if these tremors will cause later damage than they already have if they continue. Now, back to Tomorrow Worlds, sponsored by Wonder Rat Poison. Wonder if the rats survived this poison? That's a wonder. Refunds available only if you can prove we didn't kill it. After a pause, the radio show continued, as if the interruption had never happened. The sounds of a battle were taking place within the fictitious rocket ship named the Chronoskimmer. Shouting from Captain K and episode-changing sidekicks as they fought against Nemoy's alien allies, who were just as hostile as the unit robots always ready to kill. Various sounds of things banging and clunking too in the midst of battle. Some banging happening rather loudly, Patrick noted. Then came another interruption. "You're nearer to it than I am, Patrick. Could you get the door, please?" Jocelyn asked from another room. Elsewhere in the apartment, they also treated as a business practice. Patrick assumed likely she was in the area of it she'd personally decided to use for study. Turning the volume down on the radio, he blushed at his mistake of hearing, as he looked again to the newspaper he'd been holding after wiping sweat from his brow, rereading the title of the article, which had struck his attention to worry, the announcement which had interrupted one of the programs he enjoyed listening to, and adding to the growing concern he'd had building for days. Both had finally rattled him too much to ignore. He had to do something. While he turned off the radio and started getting up from the chair he'd been in, Jocelyn, his longtime friend and coworker, was busy briskly walking past the open doorway to where he was. He didn't even need to see her face. He knew her that well. She was upset, and clearly he'd taken too long in acting to get the door. Quickly pulling open the door, leading out to the hallway, Jocelyn also made just as fast a note of the person standing in front of her now. Standing in the hallway was a man in a decorated military uniform, wanting to show her powers of observation and deduction at work. A good thing to do if this man was only considering hiring, but had not made up his mind yet. This would maybe impress him. If he'd already made the decision to hire, then it would be confirmed icing on the cake for him of her skills. Before he could open his mouth, she questioned stated, "General?" Extending a hand to shake with his greeter, the military officer replied, "Sergeant Fuller, this is a detective agency, right?" Or her guess would make her look like a fool. As the 78-year-old wondered now how badly the mistake reflected on her judgment of assumed fact. She got relief that Sergeant Fuller was on the second sword which came seeking to hire. He'd apparently had already made up his mind, seeming to not notice her, blushing at what she'd done. Motioning with a gentle wave of one hand forward, he wanted to come into the living room behind her. And moving into the room, beyond the lady detective who had stepped aside right after he'd made his statement of wanting to step in, the sergeant looked to be taking in the feel of the place with mild, amused fascination. Having seen that look before in earlier clients, Jocelyn voiced, "Acme, and we try." Turning to face her with a concerned look on his face, combined with the quizzical and the arching of an eyebrow, he asked, "You aren't officially recognized, correct? Not fully in league with official city recordings and business records?" Knowing something was clearly up, and if it's funny business, what sort could the sergeant possibly be doing? Motioning for him to take a seat in the nicest chair of the room, the one while never voiced to company, at least not company in Acme's employ. Both she and Patrick used the intent of trying to impress clients, an item of luxury as far as they saw it. Mahogany framing and padded leather encased cushions. It had been purchased many years ago on a whim of indulgence after having solved a case which had been hard to deal with, but had paid in the end lavishly. Settling into the chair, Fuller flicked his eyes around his surroundings once more and asked, "Is this an office or a home?" Taking a seat herself, but on top of an ottoman nearby, Jocelyn answered, "Home, but it doubles as an office. But what you want isn't official, correct? And why is that?" Feeling a further elaboration should be given, she then added to her commentating, "Acme is simply not only because a business license hasn't been filed for it." Having accepted given information, now Fuller was ready to get to business. The reason he'd come to her and to them. He did still wonder why he only saw one employee in front of him. Surely, with what he'd been told coming to him second-hand, the agency had more than just one woman in its employ. Or maybe she wasn't an active detective, only a representative to dispense information and handle odd jobs. Like maybe she was the front for real workers, ready to better engage if needed conversation, he added. I work for Fort Sherman, and there is a problem, miss. Derise. Jocelyn replied, just a touch annoyed by the question. She knew he hadn't found the Acme Detective Agency through what was forced presentation in the white pages now. Otherwise, he'd guess either her last name or Patrick's. The listing was present in the phone book, but not as preferred. Not a recognized business, and as so exempt from being allowed in the proper yellow pages, its listing reading, Acme J. DeRise and P. Gardner Agency, 555-2460. He'd better speak with a real person soon. DeRise seeming miffed at just saying her last name, he pressed the button without realizing it. An observation beyond her face, she seemed to have other buttons too, but he felt unsure of that. Some form of prosthesis on her right hand and forearm. Not a glove, he was almost sure. It appeared to have buttons on some of its knuckles. Attempting to steer the conversation away from her, he queried, I guess it's your husband that handles the cases? Having been listening to his friend and their guest talking nearby in the largest room of the apartment, Patrick proceeded to roll his eyes before rolling up the newspaper he'd started to read its other contents to get up and make his way into the room they were in. Already a familiar expression was coming from Jocelyn in response to Fuller's question. I'm not married. Patrick and I, we both take cases. Stunned at the information she just told him, the sergeant replied, But the possible danger, Mr. Rise. I can handle any sort of case you can throw at me, and something tells me whatever is happening with Fort Sherman is a doozy. Not something she'd said in the past, but similar-sounding words had been uttered by her many times before. She'd proven her ability to handle tough situations, some of them even with military present, but not recently. While Sergeant Fuller was new to her acquaintance, she'd heard the name Fort Sherman before. She and Patrick had also visited Fort Bragg working a case. Also with added company while working, had visited Vimy Ridge, France, a few days away from the rumored battle to come years back. That had ended with success, but she'd never admit that to Fuller. The rumor which had turned out to be true, that while there, she couldn't wait to leave the region out of fear. Having entered the room, Patrick chose to lean himself against the doorframe leading to the hallway and to look at Fuller expectantly. To place himself into the conversation, he pointed out, I could hear everything from what you'd call my office, Sergeant. The sergeant knew now he had started relaying the matter of why he'd come to them. The fort's problem, we've somehow losing our shipments. Weapons and ammo were received from the factories to them. It's our job to make sure that's escorted safely overseas to our forces. We're getting our shipments in, but they vanished before we ship them out, and an interceptor within the ranks. Putting his head in his hands, Fuller continued. Because of the nature of the crime and not knowing who or how many who's at the fort are helping commit this act, because it feels like an embarrassment to my name and those higher than me that know any of this, now you can put aside any suspicions you might have towards me of wanting you to do an unscrupulous act in when I asked about Acme's stance on records. Not hard to see a solution here, Jocelyn pointed out. We can always not create a lasting file on this. But we expect to be paid nicely for it, Patrick said, making his mark on the word in question of them taking it. Further stunned, Fuller looked at Patrick in disbelief as to his questionable professionalism, sizing him up as if the man were a new member of staff or recruit straight out of boot camp. This person in the doorway didn't look to be of age one would still be making jokes at, of any immaturity being a thing of the distant past. He looked to be about as old as the woman sitting nearby, and breaking the officer's train of thought, Jocelyn commented, We only ask a standard fee for services rendered. Agreed, Fuller said, relieved as he got up from the chair he'd been in, and then directing his attention to the lady again, he added, Anything you or the gentleman needs, just ring me at the fort, and I'll make sure it happens. Anything which helps you investigate the case, you understand? Up from the ottoman and keeping pace with the guest, Jocelyn opened the door he'd entered through and added in reply to his question, I do. Pocketing his hands and walking to his partner, meeting Jocelyn at the door, looking none as if his comment to the sergeant wasn't a bad suggestion, Patrick made momentary note of it before moving on to a different matter of discussion. We could use a better presentation here. Acme doesn't have to and shouldn't really look like this at all. That being a home with minor touches of a police station's more formal office. Extra money would help that. Also, before I leap into this case, mind if I take care of something non-criminal? Giving a grin at him before staring at the nearest window of the room, which faced toward the street, Jocelyn commented, then questioned. If we had more help right now, we could justify charging Sergeant Fuller a higher rate. but I'm not going to do that simply to spruce up the look of our formality. Also, what non-criminal matter? I have one guess, but I'm not sure I'm right about it, because I've been sure you would have said something before now. As the lady checked the barometer and thermometer by the window, he spoke. Those minor tremors, and yes, I see why you didn't have commented on them earlier, but I wanted to dismiss them. We shouldn't get them right. No real fault line here, and there is construction taking place before our feet anyway. The merging of the INT and BMT lines. However, I don't think it was just common subway construction those reports would be happening. Something is going on natural, or not, and my only concern is my pals. Jocelyn, I have to check on them first. It's 90 degrees outside. No wonder it's so hot in here. I can picture outside can only be worse. Maybe an extra charge to Sergeant Fuller wouldn't be a bad idea. We could get an additional ceiling fan, Jocelyn said half to herself and Patrick before turning to him and saying, Grab a flashlight and pack extra batteries. Your friends are our first priority to check on, but after that... Leaving for the kitchen before there, opening up its cupboard and reaching to its near last shelf for a set of D-cells, Patrick finished her words in saying, I contact you, and we both work the case. Days without discovering some form of new evidence, what had happened and to what degree was his case, at least what appeared as to officially be his case. Finding out the whereabouts of a man named Dennis Fannin. The concern to locate him had been brought to the Partlow, Bumpus, and Sullivan Detective Agency, otherwise short in speech to the PBS Detective Agency by way of the man supervisor at his workplace. Fannin had been not only dependable to always show up for his job, but had also been friends with his higher-ranking coworker for the associate to know something was wrong in Fannin's life. Nothing about the rent, other bills, or even buying food. He had no complaints about his salary, and the supervisor knew he was content to use taxis and the occasional subway train to get where he needed to be minus on foot. So wanting to buy a new car, but not speaking up about the fact, he spoke of needing money, but had refused to clarify the need behind it. When the supervisor noticed people coming into the factory which didn't seem interested in striking deals on produced merchandise, that they had an air to them that spoke of business better conducted in shadows than light. Looking to have a word with Fannin, having caught him more than once nervously flipping an unlit cigarette around in his fingers in one hand in an alleyway, relaying the reason why he didn't puff it was he wasn't sure he'd have the time to enjoy it before unsaid. The supervisor had assumed business with the unsavory-looking group of people seen before. Chester Bumpus was worried about all he knew about this, and it wasn't much. The mob was his guess what had happened to Fannin. It seemed agreed that could have been it across the board. This coming from both Eli Partlow, his supervisor, and Trey Sullivan, a more seasoned detective than himself, and even Chief Partlow, who had decided to do his work from his desk rather than be out in the field. What little more Chester had deduced was it couldn't have been from one of the mafia organizations they readily knew about in the city. All of those had in recent times either been locked in jail locally, the Commission, Northeast, and Midwest, or had been caught over state lines and met the same fate, Murder, Inc., the National Crime Syndicate, and the Neapolitan Camorra. Lastly, furthermore, what had rapidly grown into one of the largest ones on the East Coast, but hadn't been seen in the city in years. Surely Skolix Enterprises had nothing to do with this unless they'd returned. Could this have been the work of a group he'd only heard rumor about, but hadn't had the luck of discovering if they were out there? Having the time to look into what was something he'd had luxury yet to have. By the time he'd figured out who might be behind Fannin's disappearance, his split shift was starting. Not that he truly minded the figurative downtime. What bothered him a little was taking an official lapse in temporary job responsibility. If his part-time replacement, Sherry Thigpen, had discovered new facts to the case, he'd feel better about that day. Then he'd have much-needed information he hopefully could follow up on, within speed to satisfy all curious parties who by now were writing off the case. Entering his office without a knock, the secretary by job description but a detective informally, Sherry took note of him in deep thought staring at his desk. Unsure if the man was aware of her presence, she sat her folder of pride right in front of his gaze. Taking immediate notice of her favorite possession, at least in a work environment, the folder she used to hold all collected findings and along with all personal thought notes she felt relevant to whatever case she was on at the moment. He propped up his glasses further on the bridge of his nose and looked at her as she said, "It's worth it, but Chester, I wish it were truly worth it. This is the latest I've gotten done on the Y shift." As he took hold of the folder, parting it open a little, noticing that it had new paper stuffed in it, he replied, "As you know of the best outlook one could have on life now, Sherry, it's one thing to live for today, but it's a better thing to live for tomorrow. Besides, that in our record keeping and investigating on the Y and Z, the extra money helps, right?" Feeling brightened by his reminder about what Y-Shift did for her, she answered him, "Considering my salary in the official book to this place doesn't do much to put food on the table, Chess. Last night I had steak because of this." Steak? What grocery store or butcher shop had that come out of? The last fine meal he'd had come from getting praise after a case that had been particularly uneasy to crack. He'd been given an extra $4 as a thank you, and Sherry had politely refused to share in the wealth. She knew she had not much involvement in solving the theft, and she was handling her bills well that month. He'd gotten himself not only an overdue pair of new socks, but also a tie and a meal of a quarter chicken with all the trimmings. She had to have saved up for that steak. Smiling at the thought that he could be taking more cues from her than just case tips, he replied, "Then we better solve this case to keep that steak coming. While I don't want to write off Dennis Fannin for dead, finding him is a priority. Let's hope Chief Detective Partlow is wrong here." Memorizing the active times for the city's various subway trains had happened by necessity, and lucky for Patrick, the trains rarely deviated from their schedules. He'd been able to hop down into the track area from the boarding area unnoticed while people bustled into the passenger cars. Stopping this act, he knew, should have been a city priority. They should have barriers preventing the drop, because if someone didn't know what they were doing, where the trains normally flew by, they'd be killed. But the creation of barriers might impede people from entering the cars, and then, of course, discourage them from using the trains, costing the system money. That just couldn't happen, and as a result of that, opportunity happened. Starting to walk down the tunnel, he knew he'd soon have to exchange for another less traveled by steel boxes. He thought about how he knew some viewed opportunity down here. It wasn't housing per se, the tunnels and their forgotten areas and abandoned stations. Those acted like shelter to the people he knew, which couldn't afford a place to live above ground. He'd heard of maybe only a handful of people living in them prior to the Depression. Once that kicked in, the population needing the place skyrocketed. Then he knew for a fact people were living in them because of a few of them happened to be friends of his. Hit hard by the bad times, walking through the tunnels made him feel a couple of ways: pity on those he wished had a better lot in life, and gratitude for when he could easily have been considered homeless. At that time, he had an above-ground place he could call home. People tended to never bother. Calling out and hoping only the people he wanted to heard him, the Acme detective said, "Rowan, Emerson, Linus, Nash, Hannah." The Warware's house, as he called it, had been a lucky find he'd been shocked no one seemed to know about. Military surplus of all which happened to be Civil War related, both Union and Confederate piled together. For the longest time he thought he'd never have a more safer place to live than that. Sure, it could be cold in the wintertime, and for the longest time having refused to light matches in the place for fear of an accident occurring. But in time that judgment restraint loosened, and he felt relaxed enough to light oil lamps. Good for the hands, he knew, but not really good for warming the rest of the body. Meeting Jocelyn, then quickly head-on dealing with Vile for the first time, ended his time there. Nothing like the bad guys causing an explosion in your home to force you out. Even after the bomb was dropped, and the place of safety was compromised, it had served as shelter until both he and his friend got a better place to live. These people here weren't as fortunate. They didn't have valuable things they could easily sell off, or money given by a passed-on loved one's will to fund them. Knowing he had to keep trying, Patrick tried calling out to his friends again. Even if one answered, he could find out how they were doing, and maybe they knew how the others were handling the shakes. "Hannah, Linus, Emerson, Nash, Rowan." The lighting became more spaced out in bulb placement, and even some bulbs in need of replacing the city had not gotten to yet. The tunnel he'd been walking down separate from the one he started in from, not being one commonly used. He knew in a short time further down it, he'd have no light at all, soon on the path unless a train was redirected to it, and that's the light he would not welcome. Space to hug the wall or not, relishing a train coming at him was far from being in the cards for what his want. But that sort of thing rarely happened, and knowing what his friends down here thought of law enforcement, at least the kind interested in booting them out of the tunnels. Grabbing out his flashlight from his rear pants pocket, he said under his breath while clicking on the light, "Sorry guys, but I have to know where I'm going." If he'd been prepared for conflict, he never would have let this happen, being caught off guard. Suddenly being grabbed by the arm while Restrictor's second hand grabbed his hand with the flashlight, all Patrick could do, which wasn't much, was to exclaim, "Who the fucking heck?" In truth, he wanted to get into a fight, but the grasp the unknown had on him prevented that. The person who had taken hold of him was stronger, likely younger. Did he have any enemies down here? None rang to mind, although he was keenly aware he did have enemies which spanned the globe. As he thought about the fact, he shouldn't have come down into the subway tunnels alone. With the flashlight now having the unknown hands cover its face, that line of thought stopped. "You dumb flatfoot, what is wrong with you?" The unknown spoke, revealing to the detective he knew the man. This wasn't an enemy, this was a friend. "Linus, what is wrong with you?" Patrick questioned in a sharp toning, while the grip Linus had loosened up on his arm, but not the flashlight. How could the long extra arm of the law be so dense, Linus wondered. Then, figuring maybe he did know something was going on, but the investigation was only just starting. The tunnel dweller figured he'd test his friend's knowledge of his environment by stating, "No flashlights like that down here. You know they make people like me nervous. Besides, that's extra reason now to lay low." Confused about the second half of what had been said, all logic telling him Mother Nature and her minor tantrums of tremors couldn't possibly have an agenda against the city's homeless. Although he knew during a winter storm or hot day like it was today, that perfect reasoning felt afraid of making sense in the punishment they did. Not understanding without figuring out the cause for comment, Patrick asked, "What extra reason?" "Line, I came down here to check on you guys, the tremors. There's something else making you fearful aside from that, and cops." "Patty, I wish you could see my face right now from shock. You don't know?" replied his buddy, that now no longer holding onto his arm, trying not to break his contact with the flashlight, then moved to be in front of the Acme detective. Long ago, Patrick had given up on stopping people in the pursuit to nickname him. He'd let Jocelyn try at nicknaming him for quite a while, when he was first getting to know her. He'd been unhappy about her insistence, but kept letting it slide. One of Patrick's being the one she favored the most. He guessed since it sounded weird and he'd heard it no one else tried on him, is why she tried to keep using it on him. This had actually been helpful when the both of them were working undercover, and she'd wanted to have some fun with him. Not wanting to use their real names, he kept calling her what at least she accepted of the nickname Gadget Girl. When confronted with the criminals that they had sought out to catch in the act, then catching them the detectives first, the villains weren't aware of who they were in the presence of and had verbally dismissed them by calling them freaks. Learning it could pay off not to be called by his true name due to that case is when he just let the matter finally drop. Sighing at first, he then queried, "Spilling lines? What should I know?" This won't make me feel bad in my line of work, will it?" "New York City can't have tremors. It's vile, knucklehead." Linus was surprised while he'd shouted his reply and answered. Patrick hadn't known of his greatest foe was in his friend's home. His visit had come over a false idea, and the one who had to live in the tunnels had just lost control of his voice. Lord, if that foe had just heard him, he knew he'd be getting a bad surprise much worse than his friend's lack of knowledge. "What? How can they cause them? Some kind of newfangled tech? God, them down here? No wonder you're less fond of light now," Patrick shouted before lowering his voice in reply, this blistering his anger in the fact that now being worn on the sleeve having said it aloud. No place was safe from them. He'd known that for ages, but invading his friend's refuge was just another added last straw to a long list of lines Vile had crossed in the past. Even the usage of terming last straw being what he'd used, having lost meaning in this, had him trying to think of new ways to define ever-descending lows the villain's International League of Evil got up to. He swore to those who knew him well that a way to define their acts of loathsome behavior, how he'd stated, deserved a new listing in the Merriam-Webster dictionary when he finally came up with a wording for it. "And we can't call on the freaking police, Pat. Ideas here? I mean, you're on our side. You even tried to shack up with some of us as best you could when you had available spaces, but you're still kind of the law. How do we get rid of the tunnels of them?" Linus stated and questioned inwardly, felt he had pleaded to the detective. He had to get a better idea of what was happening. What could cause such alarm beyond the obvious? Holding his emotion in check, since shouting he knew wasn't a good idea, Patrick asked, "Could you show me precisely what is going on to give me a better picture? Maybe a mental kodak, I can start forming ideas to help the situation." Remembering his duty to fellow tunnel dwellers, which was actually more of an urge to keep himself, them, and his above-ground living friends safe, yanking his one hand still on the flashlight Patrick was refusing to let go of, Linus told him, "Great idea. I'll lead the way, but we gotta stay real quiet." "You can see in the dark?" The detective knew Linus couldn't actually do just that, but he knew if you got used to being in the dimly lit area, you tended to learn it well in just knowing where things were. At least if the things around you didn't move much thanks to people around you. "No, you ninny. Just let go of the damn flashlight and trust me to conceal most of its light. Just follow my lead with it or hold my hand, okay?" The tunnel dweller demanded, wondering if his friend fully understood the gravity of his words. After taking in a deep breath through his nose, Patrick then said, Sure, as I want to keep breathing, I got it. Both of them had been too active talking where they were, and they had just be toned down. Walking into the tunnel further from its more active connections busy with the city above, they went along in silence, except an occasional warning from Linus for Patrick to watch his footing more closely. Decades of work and equal of neglect in some parts of the system, of rooms, of passages, and yet more train-line tunnels. As they walked this, Patrick knew he should have figured Viles saw this place as a perfect opportunity for their work. He just wished the thought had dawned on him earlier. He'd done this sort of thing before, playing an undercover role and hoping to uncover new information. In this case, it was looking like he was a vagrant and resting up in the alley Fannin had been going to before he disappeared. Chester's hope was that if he stayed here long enough, the right, wrong-minded people might show up to conduct business with someone else in their social pool. The early midday heat wanted to urge him elsewhere. The detective for PBS had decided to dress up as he'd seen beggars do, which wasn't his normal style. It had taken a third of his wardrobe of summer and winter clothes to complete the look. He'd been proud of the disguise in his apartment, looking at himself in the long bathroom mirror to ensure he'd done right of creating the wanted badly off appearance. He didn't start to feel he'd made a mistake until he started jogging to greet the alley to do his work in. Keeping the brisk pace as to hope no one knew who he was, would recognize him in his normal area of town to be wandering. It started to heat up fast in the layers covering every inch of him but his head and hands. He brushed away the thought that early on sweating could be the sign of a problem. After all, soon he'd be doing nothing but sitting on the pavement with his back to a building's brick and mortar. Surely further overheating couldn't happen for lack of any notable movement from him, he thought. For a few minutes, not thinking about what he was going to do hard, Chester thought he had a minor solution to feeling like he was in Death Valley as opposed to New York City. He'd given up holding a hand on his head where he'd wanted to. That he gripped to himself had taken away being about to see if anyone happened to come upon where he was. The sort of people he was anxious to encounter. The solution idea had been grabbing a discarded newspaper, found by his planted spot, and use it for a light shade. At least the paper had some slim transparency to it, and he could read it while waiting for his job to get interested. July 11, 1943, New York Times. According to General Eisenhower, troops of Allied forces had landed in Sicily. He had to guess at what he was reading a little. The print was too near his face, and he'd only known it was Times by having seen the title while the paper had been on the ground. Reading it felt like an eye test, but in the reversal of what a doctor might do. Long distance and tiny, although here it was, as if you were seeing the print on a large movie screen. Old news, the paper was from a few days ago. The dang rag didn't seem to be making a difference in shielding him from the heat. Giving up attempting to read the print too close to his face, the young detective pulled it off of himself, and in one hand attempted to crumple the pages inwards to a half-fashioned ball before throwing it away in front of him. It hit a dirty mug. He hadn't quite realized what was in the line of fire. He'd seen it when sitting down, and even thought it was amusing part ways when the mug was utilized by passers-by. They were convinced of that he was the role he was playing. That was good, and what he'd taken enjoyment in. What he didn't like was the exact same further in thought. Of he knew he wasn't a bum, and their pity on him wasn't deserved. One person had thrown into the mug what looked like a penny and a nickel. When another had thrown in, a child had tossed, and that item he wasn't sure on what it was. Whatever it was had hit the ceramic vessel with such a noise, he felt it impolite to look at what had thudded into it when it happened. The reason not to check back then. What if the child should think he thought it offensive and the object was not loose change? Now he picked up the mug to look at it more closely. Indeed, he had been right about the sixth sense. What he found as a result of the child he should have guessed in advance about. It was a toy, but specifically a pure blue marble. And lifting out the marble to examine his appearance better of taking in his dark hue broken with tiny bubbles that had been captured forever in the glass, he began thinking of how much he wanted a glass of water just then, and also that would be a bad idea if he were to use the mug for it. Maybe now was a good time to take a break and find a better, clean cup to drink from. The work as per normal to office duties were still taking place back at the agency. His job should only be trying to locate a body with the help of the police, not attempting to discover if that body was still alive and reporting on the matter. Partlow wouldn't be pleased with him deviating from his task. Sullivan might use that fact to prevent him from taking the next high-dollar case that came their way. Sherry knew what he was doing, but he couldn't just waltz in with her only to back him up and with a spur-of-the-moment lies to cover up for his appearance. Could he just return to his department for the break? No, he'd already dealt once today with avoiding his neighbors to keep his act unknown to them. He didn't want to risk being caught a second time. However, what if it wasn't the neck of the woods he hung out for in the break? What if Sherry did him the favor? Let him stay at her place for a little. Her area of town had barely seen him in the past. He only visited her 4 times at her home, and twice to discuss facts acquired by both on the Y and Z shifts. They didn't want to talk about it in the office. The other time it had simply been helping her out, take care of some tasks she had a little trouble doing solo in her space. Another time still, him visiting had happened because his place had a scheduled fumigation happening to it, and he couldn't stick around for. Her place had been the only one he knew he could stay at during the time without paying for it. She surely knew he could be trusted with her apartment's keys, and that he would hand it back gladly when done with it. All he had to do in turning it in would be greeting her outside the agency with it. Having decided that was the best course of action, and getting up from the spot he had been keeping to for, he looked at his watch and then took note it had been nearly 3 hours since getting to the alley. Moving away from it, knowing better than to do the incriminating thing of walking inside the PBS detective agency, he got to the right person outside it and watched for Sherry to enter his space, specifically his exact office at the agency. It had 2 windows looking out onto the street, and if Sherry decided she needed to go into where he normally worked, then he could grab her attention and ask for the key in question. Moving the pure marble around between his fingers, keeping his attention focused on the windows, Y Shift's sole worker entered into his view after a few minutes. He couldn't see what she was doing, but the guess of what it was probably was easy. She was likely either putting papers down onto his desk or collecting them. He hoped not collecting them for a single reason. Her duties involving collecting papers from him could mean either the chief wasn't happy with his handwriting, and she had to read it over and then to type it and look more formal. That was the reason he wasn't thrilled with, if that were the case. He'd gotten complaints about his handwriting a few times, but he couldn't help how it was ingrained into him how to do the act. After all, he thought, and knew for a widespread fact, everyone had their own style of it. He just wasn't kindly accepted to those above him on the work totem pole and to a few others outside that environment. Another reason of this being one which didn't rub him the wrong way. It could simply be she was gathering his finished work he'd failed to present earlier to Partlow. Snapping his thoughts out of thinking about what could she be doing in his office, seeing the lady in deep, muted copper with black hair about to leave sight of the window nearest his desk. Chester took aim and threw the marble at the segmented panes of glass which made up his normal view of the world from his workspace. The blue glass ball with a sharp, loud click did its job as it struck the window. Sherry, almost out of range from his field of vision, turned towards where she'd heard the noise, and then went to the window to investigate what had just happened. Seeing Best assume the course that had helped create the sound which had pinged the window, she got shocked at the sight that greeted her. Chester looked 1 step shy of a wreck, but knowing him, surely that look served some purpose. Opening up the window, then she shouted down to him, "What is it, Chest? I'm under cover." He knew it was rude to cut her off like that, but standing there near his workplace, that was akin to being in the vicinity of his apartment right now. He just wanted to get to the point of why he had stopped by fast. It didn't take his coworker long to figure out what he was up to. Sherry had compiled together what she'd figured out, which to her knowledge was the last thing Chester had to work from on case facts. Said standard routes weren't being helpful for the investigation. This was his answer. It fit exactly right for his appearance, and she wasn't 100% sure he knew it. To make her point to him of that observation, she exclaimed, "You don't look it totally. Scramble your hair." "No," he answered. That was somewhat at the core of what little vanity he had coming out in the simple reply given. He was proud that, unlike others, he had heard complain about this over time in regards to themselves. Them saying they either had bad or unmanageable hair, his worked easily at being cropped to mostly just over an inch with leniency to that length on top of his head, which had a natural curl to it. That and making sure to, on normal days, always dress as formal to middle-class life as he could. Because of that, no one ever had cause to say he looked shabby. It was pride, the opinion to thought fact that made Sherry shake her head no as she disappeared from the window for a few seconds. When she returned, Chester noticed she'd grabbed out a Frederick fedora from the Lost and Found. Before she tossed it out the window to him, she made sure to alter it. 1 swift punch into its center before grabbing its brim with both hands to try and crinkle it. Chester was sure if its owner ever returned to the PBS detective agency looking for it, they wouldn't be happy with how their property had been handled. When he snatched up the hat from the ground after having missed the catch of it while it had been in air, he asked, "Can I stay at your place for a few hours? I can't go to my own place right now." "Crime doesn't rest, Blondie," she delivered her reply to him, sounding as ultra-sweet and sarcastic as she could. It wasn't needed, but for extra measure, even batted her eyelashes while saying the words. Doing this she knew was being mean. Sherry guessed that the idea to act this way towards him had to do with her normal way to handle men wanting into her place. Brushing them off because with her experiences to most dates, they wanted to move too fast. To that thought in her judgment, it meant her place was off limits. She knew Chester was trustworthy, but he didn't truly need to be in her home currently. Noting how the heat of the day was affecting him did give her pause. She could see he was sweating, and bed was worse for what she couldn't see given how many layers of clothes it appeared he was wearing. Figuring this had to be the best way to get to his nonsense to end faster, of unintentionally giving himself heat stroke, she asked him, "Would you like me to help here speed things up? Partlow hasn't been in his office for about an hour, and Sullivan is listening to a 45. He'd take the offer. Wondering what exactly she had in mind, to that he commented, "Sure thing, but I don't know what you could do up in my office. Unless you've located Fannin, or know who does know his location." The man wasn't dumb, and she was grateful to that, but knew he'd be much more to her soon. Her idea, if it worked, it was risky, also was baking in the sun. Although if trouble happened through this, it would mean he'd have better control over getting himself out of it, as opposed to needing medical attention and maybe drinking likely a gallon of cold water. Answering him, Sherry said, "Neither, but I'm sure I could get you in touch with a person or persons who would know where he was." Leaning into being about how to ask her how, this time it was she who cut him off, even though she'd only been about to open his mouth. Shouting and leaning out the window, gripping the frame of it, she proclaimed to what sounded like the whole city, if however directed at him, "Denny! Dennis Fannin, is that you? I've been looking everywhere for you. Have you heard what I have? You're wanted, Sugar Plum." Taking her cue for him to scat by her breaking one hand from the window's frame, motioning with it, wave flicking towards him, pointed off to assume beyond where he stood, Chester took a tight down grip on the hat she'd given him. Holding it firmly against his head, he proceeded to start running away from the locality of his workplace. She continued her shouting, now raising her voice even higher. "You stay away until you don't look like something the cat dragged in. Danny, you'd better run away from me now." As the young detective ran down the block and onto the next following it, hearing his friend shout that way made him wonder a bit why she'd chosen the job she had. Yes, she did a good job as a secretary, even if it wasn't what she really wanted to do with her life. That being said, his job and the same held by the other man at that agency. Perhaps joining the agency was just her way of feeling close to what she wanted, but couldn't have by unfair policy. At least he'd figured out early in their working relationship, turning away fast to friendship, she had a knack for detective work. Putting aside that having pipes that could maybe put an opera singer who didn't need a microphone to shame, he betted she'd do a great job for a Broadway show if she ever decided to audition for one. The shouting and his running to go with the axe she'd thrown on him was working. People were taking notice of him moving away from her voice, and him having the air of a fleeing small animal, hearing predatory sounds endangering its life. Under his breath, he spoke to himself. Very subtle, Miss Thigpen. Very subtle. Wondering how far he should be taking this act, that, if Chief Partlow ever caught wind of the impersonation he was doing to get the job done, but hopefully more precisely had done, since him catching Chester now spelled work trouble. What would the chief do in his place? Maybe if Mr. Fannin really was dead, he should play into that role? Pulling on his guest and mimicking acting out a heart attack, he made his way to stumbling over to the railing lining a set of steps outside of Gimbel's. It wasn't far from the truth, this act. He really wasn't feeling too great and frankly wanted only to drop onto the sidewalk right there and then. Not from any heart problems, but from the heat of the clothes cooking him. Red in the face, he was sure, Chester gasped out loud as he could. "I'm dead. Dear God, I'm going to die. And my wife, she's right. I'm a goner." Departing the department store, having witnessed half of what the detective in disguise was doing, one former shopper named Diego McCoy, who most of the time preferred people call him the Dusty Devil, frowned at the act as he ascended the stairs to greet the entrance of the sidewalk. Letting another go past him, and placing what looked to be a rather heavy store-labeled bag on the pavement, he told Chester just what he thought of him in his glancing introduction. "No, you're a lousy actor. What is it you're doing here? Trying to get a dime or two?" Only peering up at the McCoy for a moment, the PBS employee wanted to see the face of the one who'd spoken to him. Was he really performing that badly? Noting the bitter expression on the man's face, yes, he wasn't a good actor. On the bright side, at least, he had 6th sense, and a now-gone marvel to prove some bought into his attempted performance. Unsure what to say, only who he was faking himself to be, Chester said to McCoy, "Dennis Fannin. I'm Dennis Fannin." Shaking his head to the motion of no, then bending down to the young detective, the Dusty Devil gave him a scrutinizing look, even going so far as to grab part of Chester's last of 4 shirts layered to him before saying, "And a much worse liar, but then again, that's the same thing as acting. Why do you want to claim you're D. Fannin? In this area of town? His home turf?" Grabbing McCoy's hand off his striped dress shirt, not wanting to tip his hat really to give the man a true answer. In the awkward silence, the detective remembered something he had been taught growing up his father used to say sometimes. Smile. It confuses people. Rubbing a hand down his face to one side, figuring out the grinning person, who he was sure now he was right to peg as an idiot, this led to the Dusty Devil to ask Chester, "Do you want to take responsibility for what he couldn't?" Excited but wary, knowing this was a break in the case, a connection to the missing man, restraining his enthusiasm in his demeanor, Chester replied in question, "What does that responsibility entail?" $200 and a night with your wife for making my people wait for you to fulfill contract obligation. Me and a few people I work with, she'll be a great back pay," McCoy said, happy with his response he'd given. Having just returned himself back to full height, grabbing back his shopping bag, he wagged it a little in the air by way of his handles before returning his attention back to Chester. Dusty could see the man was in some kind of shock and wanted to see where that might lead to. He knew that to most men, talking about a night with their wife was acceptable, given his work position granted him some power over them. But this fellow, too overdressed for July's heat, wasn't a drifter. Not a stable person, and certainly no one to whom his work had a relationship with at least one he knew of. Work he knew was vast, but for its current clients under their thumb in this city. This person he felt, being beyond an idiot, must have been full-on ignorant of society's underbelly. Chester was inwardly panicking. He should have never said he had a wife when he didn't. Even the real Dennis Fannin didn't have a wife. The case, when given over to the PBS detective agency, it was given by the man's employer, not a loved one. If Sherry learned of his falsehoods, he'd said, worse yet, if this man figured out where Sherry was and thought she was actually married to him, he didn't want her to suffer the repercussions of his fibbing. "Go suck a lemon," was all Chester could think to say in response, glaring at McCoy, holding the heavy-looking shopping bag. The reaction the words got was not the wanted one. Not verbal confrontation and wanting to better understand what the disguised detective's connection to Fannin was, or backing off at the insult, which is how most would react. What he got instead was a swift action to the back of his head, by use of the loaded shopping bag, followed by his vision going to blackness. Going over to sit at his desk to reach for his phone, Private First Class Officer Bayonne Niote wondered again about the new company. The elderly lady who told him she worked for a detective agency named Acme, and that her name was Jocelyn DeRise. He'd never heard that before. He didn't also put stock in her name. Why should he, having never heard of her employee, if they were real? Plus, she in her advanced years doing work, if that were true. Maybe she'd wandered onto the outside grounds for the fort unintentionally. That she was lucky she'd found her way into the check-in security office if something went wrong for her health. Senility he guessed, but it would be improper of him not to place a call to the person she claimed to know, Sergeant Fuller. After connecting to the sergeant's extension, only to get another filling in for the officer temporarily. A bathroom break? Neo thought to that. While waiting to speak with Fuller, he gave Jocelyn another glance. It was a disapproving one she'd seen before. He could tell that by her glaring at him, adding a hunch to her reasoning for going to his office, and a very unrealistic one. Neo stated, then asked, "He'll be on the line at any moment, Mr. Rise. Is there anything else I can help you with? Documents not meant for civilian eyes? Access to a JB-1 Bat missile?" Trying to ignore his attitude and make light of it, she replied, "I'm fine. I ate lunch about an hour ago." He wished the sergeant would get off the can faster. Surely Fuller's only response would be having her escorted away from the outside grounds and out of their hair. The lady was playing with him, and the last thing she'd said to him, he felt proved that. Wanting to just hang up the phone, but knowing how he would be deemed inappropriate to anyone who decided to query about this incident in the afterwards, the officer could at least do one thing while on hold. He could just seem like he truly believed her game, whatever it was, before grabbing out a pen he intended to make use of in short time. That being to get her number of the nearest social services agency. Neo questioned aloud, "You're a real detective?" "Yes, and I assume you're here on the home front because of how pleasant you are." When she answered him with that, she hoped it would end his direct cynicism to her. Noting the sudden voice of Sergeant Fuller on the other end of the phone, Neo almost jumped a little in his seat, getting startled by it, as the voice asked what he was calling about. Putting aside his unprofessional thoughts about this curled, silver-haired guest, he said with thought he'd heard her say after she had introduced himself to him, "Miss DeRise is here. She claims to know what happened to the missing shipments." Grabbing the phone's handset away from the officer, Jocelyn proceeded to tell Fuller about her reason to be where she was. "This isn't why I'm here at the fort, Sergeant. I'm going to repeat now what I told the gentleman who called to speak with you, doubting me. I want to gain a better understanding how these weapons got lost, Sergeant. I want us to retrace the steps until things went beyond your officer's supervision. That's the first route I think is best to start with in uncovering clues as to what happened." Fuller's reply, Jocelyn was sure Mr. Niote couldn't hear, narrowing her eyes at the officer and taking on a smug expression. The detective made certain he could see her look of satisfaction. His expression, what told her was she was in the dark about what she was being told. Sometimes she enjoyed witnessing another person's bewilderment, and this was one of those times. When the sergeant was done saying what he'd do for her to help with the investigation, she spoke into the handset to ask him, "Could you repeat what you told me to the officer I'm currently with?" Understanding this need, although unknowing it served a purpose beyond intention as he saw it, that intention beyond the norm being Jocelyn's urge to win respect from her skeptic, returned handset back to the present officer. Once Fuller acknowledged him back on the line, Niote took on a look of a sorrowful hound who'd just done something bad and knew it, as the higher-ranking officer spoke to him. When the call was finally concluded, Niote said as he hung up on his end of the line, "He'll get the same men on the job. You have authorization for shadowing, and you are expected to do just that as they direct you to follow, understood?" Taking a seat after choosing from a row of chairs along a wall which led to the door, dropping her smug expression ever so slightly, as to try and show she was still the victor, although one that needed only not much indulgence to the fact as earlier. She then answered, with pride, "Very much so." Had the road she was traveling on been created with any pride at all? Jocelyn pondered this while traveling to Fort Sherman's proper, non-civilian entry area. The truck she was in, she almost thought its driver on purpose was hitting every bump as he could as the vehicle rolled on. Instead, she thought it better, believed it was only just bad shocks to the truck system. The thing was, after all, traveling on dirt with large mixed gravel in places. With the military being on every concerned mind, whether or not they actually worked for them, the military having a well-deserved budget right now, she thought that likely not a lack of pride was what had shaped this road into being what it was, but resource money being put into other more pressing ones. Still, with how the ride was failing with random jolts from the impact, she did a habit she'd been doing for ages, whether in her younger days when it was a horse and buggy, to then the last 30 years when she'd been more often in cars. That when another was driving, and she felt the tiniest bit unsure of their skills at the reins or the wheel, she gripped her hat to her head for safekeeping. "No need to hold your hat here. I can't help the fact this road isn't paved," was said by the driver, a man she learned at the security check-in upon pickup was named Lex Martin. Not military, she was surprised to learn, but a civilian the Army had trusted business to like herself. Struggling against the instinct to keep her left hand where it was before letting go of its grip over the hat, she fondly voiced her guess about the road. "Made in a hurry?" The woman deserved an explanation, and he knew this. After taking in a deep breath through the nose and releasing it in a huff, Lex answered, "The road, yes, but not the drop-off location. When the place became active after years of disuse, this road, which led into it, had taken on being public. Due to the nature of what could carried over it now, service officers and equipment and so forth, this road was fast-tracked together, and I'm told 4 days, with the minimum of local government red tape." As the fence gate fast approached, wanting to make light of the talk, he commented, "Maybe more civilians should be allowed here more often. Haven't been lucky enough to catch a USO show here. Sure the boys would like to see some pretty girls." Paying the comment no attention in body language and eyes flicking about the fenced interior of the military establishment of dull metal surface buildings, their colors in either muted green or dark gray. Verbally, Jocelyn showed she had heard him, and in her own way wanted that line of conversation to end. "I'm likely older than your mother." Except for after showing ID and explaining presence returned with little advanced scheduling to the guard at the gate, non-engaging silence was the only follow-up until the truck stopped. Lex looked once to the face of the detective before motioning for her to stay where she was, while he exited the heavy vehicle to start fast walking to the nearest telephone booth. Silence, Jocelyn knew, sometimes helped an investigation. It kept the mind focused on what truly mattered at the moment. At that moment is when another that mattered, or at the least appeared to be, locked onto her probing eyes. They noted each other, and he was the one to break the visual stalemate by running. Without feeling much of a rage, the Acme detective sprang from the tent-topped truck, to then moving up beside the soldier, knocking him against the side of the building he'd been running along, the action throwing her in turn off balance, almost taking her down as well. Shaky with forced effort to keep pace with the former runner's actions, getting into a better stance to confront him, she placed her left hand on the nearest shoulder, grip pressing it so tightly into him to the point she was sure it caused pain. Starting to grab at her hold on him, the man who looked much like an able Army officer she'd seen from over the last few years, nothing to distinguish him much at all from his comrades except his face, the buzz cut of his hair not helping his branded appearance. He stopped to struggle once he'd taken better note of her. "You're a threat? I'm having my chain yanked. For a described Acme warhorse with a metal glove, I don't see how much you could fight in a war." "It's a prosthetic, not a glove." The reply had come out with a growl in her voice because of his immediately dismissive attitude towards her and her distaste of it. She'd had to explain her prosthetic lower right arm and hand to so many over the years, she was just tired of doing it. This one being worn wasn't her first, but by cursory glance numerous models she'd made over time, almost all had a similar look to each other. While the look of their metal altered their internal distinctions, that's what set them apart from one another. The model she currently was wearing was 4 years old, and by what little wear it showed in its present state, she was sure she could still use it effectively for several more years before replacing it again. Laughing at all the thought-inflated talk he'd heard of her, the supposed officer stated, "Now I'm even less scared. It has devices concealed in it. Call it a Swiss Army knife, but with even more useful functions. I could use some of them now if you'd like, or you could explain yourself." She told him, hoping he wouldn't press further to make her reveal her mechanical surprises. No longer believing her to be a threat, he pulled away her hand from himself and grinned at her. Shaking his head in a bemused tone to her, replied, "The Tankadere Division or any of the other divisions has nothing to fear from you." Starting to walk away from her and again shaking his head, baffled by words told to him he felt now had been over-exaggerated. Jocelyn grew more angry at him now than she'd been when he'd only verbally looked down his nose at her. Now she knew the man was a vile agent, who likely did work in the Tankadere Division. That one being the one she'd had the most encounters with. She knew of a lot of the crimes they committed for what she and Patrick, along with others like them, that also worked for Acme, had kept record of. They were just as much crafty lowlifes as the members that worked for Vile's other globally scattered divisions. Using her pointer finger, she then shot him in the left heel. It was a quick set of actions to make the baby pea-sized bullet fire. Better than had been long ago, when using her first model version. No waiting for the buildup of pressure, no need to worry one of the miniature furnaces embedded in the apparatus might accidentally burn or scald her. The current version she now wore, its pointer held, she felt certain, the world's most compact firearm. No coal needed. A pullback on the spring-controlled trigger, the click into place of the steel ball from its ring-sized 5-barrel in the firing chamber, and the strike of the needle-sized rod against the primer. The spark from that to the propellant, a series of further actions colliding with each other until result. The bullet it had fired made the false officer yip in surprise, then jerked the shot foot up for a moment before encouraging the man to turn around and face her, asking, "Your fake hand?" Pointing the compact gun at the false officer, Jocelyn stated in question, "Speaking of divisions like that and knowing I've gained fear within certain circles of foul people, I assume you're a member of Vile. You know the fate of those missing shipments, don't you, Rotter?" To the eye of one lacking knowledge to what was taking place, it looked like this. A detective, at that a detective who didn't work for the military police, pointing at a person scared but not overly alarmed. That this person is also holding up his left foot ever so slightly as to keep pressure off it, as much as he could, without removing it from the ground entirely. The intimidation from her? The reason to point what could be construed as an accusational behavior? What had he done to have this thrown onto him? "What is going on here?" shouted an officer now accompanying Lex. Both men puzzled at the sight as they joined the Acme employee by her side. Making sure the false officer could see her pull back the trigger this time on the top side of her pointer finger, a bump of a freckle-sized piece of copper which stood out on it just over a hair's breadth, she hoped was visible to him. Jocelyn answered to Lex, "I strongly suspect he works for Vile. He might have to do with those missing shipments. I haven't had the chance to question him yet." Co-worker or friend, unknown to the detective unfamiliar with uncommissioned and commissioned officers on the grounds of the base. The one that she hadn't met with prior, now with the truck driver, asked, "Okay, I get it. You have your suspicions. He might be some underhanded criminal. But finger-pointing? You don't have to do that. I can get law enforcement here in a jiff." Unwavering and glancing at the false officer and having acknowledged the question and statement, Jocelyn answered, "It's a gun. If he tries to get away again without giving some answers, I'm going to fire at him again." Not fearing retaliation from their guest law enforcement, both Lex and his unknown pal decided she needed their intervention, for her sake and the man she was confronting. Grabbing down her right arm, and to then note her compliance with the restraint, however showing a glare about it, letting them take also hold of her left arm as well to hold her in place, and make sure she couldn't reach over to pull back on her gun's trigger. the location of which neither man was too sure where. Lex, taking on an air of authority he had not in his place but hoped would still be respected, he told the Acme detective, "You questioned him in a space with walls and one door. No chance of running away, and it's done with his fort staff. Fully accountable to rule of law. Present? Got that? No more shooting people without orders." Unhappy, but recognizing she could do nothing to argue with his words, and not wanting a complicated mess on her hands more so than it already was, she gently nodded her head yes before asking, "Can I have my arms back now?" Words were not needed. Both men let go of the detective, and some might have been uttered if not for realizing fast her next actions meant nothing unwise was about to happen. That of her reaching over from left to right to grab at a prosthetic to the upper body, then push it into better, firmer positioning to fabric wrapped around what existed of the arm's remainder of elbow. It hurt, but the pain could have been worse. The injury could have been worse. The old lady could have shot him somewhere much more serious than a heel, but now caught and at that military base? These soldiers had access to weapons that paled a compact pistol. What if they turned some of those weapons on him? What if they lined up and asked him if he wanted a blindfold? What if they used interrogation techniques on him only reversed for those who were fighting overseas? The false officer, a vile agent whose real name was Infile B. Smuggler, but preferred to go by the nickname of Brad the Blizzard, kept having these thoughts race around and cloud his brain as he was escorted into a room he'd never stepped foot in before. Seeing a chair almost in his path upon entering the room, temptation to relief from the pain, Infile was ready to sit down in it to get on with what he suspected to come questioning, except denial was instantly given. The moment the detective saw his intent to bend down to greet the chair, she'd moved it away from him. At least the real military officer's presence seemed to share a little of his grievance with the lady's attitude towards him. They looked like they wanted to take action onto her, perhaps again restrain her if she took things too far a second time. The vile agent wasn't eager to discover what else her Swiss Army knife prosthetic contained. Hopefully the gun was its only lethal tool. Waiting to move away, figuratively, from what was coming next, hoping he was right about the officers, Infile asked, "Are you going to arrest her for shooting me?" The man that had joined Lex and company wore an axe, along with the other named Calver Gun, and yet another named Mickey Howitzer exchanged puzzled looks. Then afterwards Gunn answered, "We don't have the legal authority to do something like that. Also, if you really do work for Vile." "Well then, bucko, with what I've heard your side of the tracks does, when Sergeant Fuller catches wind of you, he definitely has the authority to get you sent away, at least until a judge says otherwise." Blizzard, swallowing the lump in his throat, having given up now on his ploy to get the Acme employee removed from the scene, now turned his head down to try and not make eye contact with anyone present, his intent to look as if he were studying the ground. At this he came to a decision his peers would be outraged at him about if they had been present. He was going to spill his guts. Maybe then, with him making present party's job easier, then he might get a lighter prison sentence, if lucky. Maybe even more later if Vile never realized what he'd done in the room, they'd spring him. Make sure the weapons are misplaced when they arrive here. Make sure they're near pickup location we've managed to create. I'll break in the fencing that's camouflaged. This guidance is all I do, I swear. The same thought seemed to come from everyone at once. At least those on the right side of the law. All of them wanted to speak up, but then in remembering who actually had the best standing to speak, the investigator, and more commonly called detective, that had been hired to discover what had happened to the missing weapons. Warren nodded to her direction, indicating to let Jocelyn say it. "What happens to the weapons once they're out of your hands?" After taking a breath before glancing at Jocelyn's feet to take note of where she was standing, the agents answered, "I'm told executions. People Vile wants gone without it ever being noticed has happened. The excess we provide to the other teams in our division for other jobs." Knowing full well a murder could be committed but hidden was nothing new to the sleuth. She'd been hired to solve cases like that many times, however, this felt different. It had to be with how the malefactor had worded his reply. She had to find out. How did these homicides get committed minus ever being noticed? It's noticed a little from what I can tell from the newspapers and radio, but no one thinks it's deaths, or if they do, not by gunfire. Infile told her, smiling mildly as he did so. The outlaw resisted the urge to move when the Acme employee moved in on him, once making a show of moving her fabric-gloved hand over her metal and leather one. Pausing over each metal fingertip for a moment before moving on to the next one in line, she queried him, "Then what do us other folk think is killing these people?"
The tremors at about Lexington and 2nd, Upper East Side. File does its work on its targets. If anyone notices above, it's not a scientifically unfounded event happening here. But then, if it's noticed directly, it's goodbye to the unimportant mole person. No one notices. Jocelyn was sure her face then was a similar color to her hair. Trying not to let her fear show, turning to meet eyes with the officers in the room, she asked, "Will any of you accept orders from me?" A head shake to the effect of no came from Gunn. A somewhat considered verbal answer and motion to the word of yes came from Howitzer, and then, added by Gunn rethinking his answer and head motion, since he felt now he had been wrong with it, he stated, "But we can speak to those who can give orders." Shaking a little in stressed fear, losing her outward battle to contain her emotions about what might be taking place. Actions she couldn't clearly, directly interfere with, but put people she knew their lives at stake. One of them being a friend she'd known for a long time, that she had not thought twice about when he told her where he intended to go that very day. Good then, I have some very specific orders I need followed to a T, and they need to be carried out as promptly as possible. Jocelyn told the officers, hoping despite unease about what was happening, that if things were done correctly on their part, then her idea would work out for the best. When Chester woke up, he knew instantly the pain he felt had to be from the knock on the head he'd gotten. When he opened his eyes, he found things weren't so different as they'd been shut. At least here it was cooler than it had been on East 60th Street. Temperature aside, he almost couldn't see anything around him except a person he was unfamiliar with. At least he thought he was unfamiliar with. The detective could barely make out the man's features in the darkness they were in. Topping that problem, the whole world was a shade of fuzzy to him. That being because minus his glasses, which he's starting to feel his shirt pocket for once it dawned on him the less than 20/20 perception the lad gave him. Dusty didn't want to carry you far for not wanting curious attention on him, and I picked up after him. "How much do you weigh, Buster?" the unknown asked, when noticing Chester rummage in his shirt and then pants for what he was freshly conscious man searching for bewildered him. Surely not a gun or a knife, given McCoy had knocked the man out quickly before proper suspicion had settled into his mind. "Where am I and who are you?" Chester asked, not feeling in the mood to answer his second abductor. Giving up on locating his spectacles, turning to instinct temporarily to squint before logic exerted itself that narrowing his vision made little difference with the near blackness they were in. Shaking his head at the questions, this being to the disbelief he'd answered them correctly. Then again, soon the man would be dead, so it didn't matter if the poor fellow knew who he was dealing with and where he was now. However, if a miracle of unlucky fate come upon the guy, he doubted very much. Coming a little nearer to the detective, the unknown decided to answer with, "Harper the Hurricane, and you're in the tunnels." Remembering numerous matters of the news at once, Chester was about to voice his thought on where under New York City he was. That and what he was sure wasn't just an opinion. That Harper the Hurricane wasn't a real name, but some form of nickname. Until Harper grabbed him by one arm to lift him off the ground before swiftly kicking him right below one knee. Feeling the further need to speak, the PBS employee stopped himself short, intentionally when he felt the muzzle of a gun placed an aim between his shoulder blades. The man who'd assaulted him had in part taken him down where he was, and had either a strange nickname or awful real name. Then told Chester, "Move with me." The gun on him made him not want to say a word, but maybe Hurricane would be understanding to this needed to be voiced fast. Replying in a low voice, the detective said, "I can't see where I'm going. I don't have my glasses with me." Before Harper replied vocally to Chester, what he did to start was to press the gun more deeply into the man's back. "All the better. I've grown used to the low light down here. You're not seeing what's all around here. You're not getting ideas about how to get away from me. Works just fine." Removing his hand from Chester's arm, Harper then gave another kick to his captive, this time right in behind the kneecap. Just as the man suffering from ataxicism was about to fall, Harper grabbed a hold of him again and started to walk forward, forcing the detective to do the same. This kick, the vile man noticed, brought out compliance without needless chatter coming from his near-blind hostage. The place made Linus feel unease and sadness as he entered with Patrick into the man-made cavern. It, many years back, had served as a storage place for construction equipment and a work base for those that had helped create it. Now it served a different purpose, and not one he and his fellow homeless neighbors wanted it to. After it had been abandoned for years, they had taken to treating it like a new home far from law enforcement's prying eyes. But it was that last part about the subterranean real estate which had attracted its most recent occupants. That had driven more friendly inhabitants out of it. Stopping where he was, he motioned with Patrick's flashlight to the ground. The detective stopped in his tracks too at this and looked at where the flashlight was pointing. The body, from what Patrick guessed, had been there for days by its look and smell. Morbid curiosity taking over him, Patrick then crouched down beside the body to try and take in what he was seeing. The old man was grateful. He didn't know the person. But what he wondered about was the cause of death. It didn't look like a normal murder, but then again, murder could be carried out in so many ways. If Lyle really was behind this person's death, annoyed by the lack of light, the Acme detective tried to motion to his friend to uncover his hand from the front of the flashlight he had been holding. Linus let go only when realizing the detective was trying to do his job. Then again, the homeless man thought he could just tell his buddy what he'd seen happen. Not to this person, but he was sure he knew the person's passing likely had happened one of two ways. Keeping his voice near a whisper, he told Patrick, "There are many other bodies down in this area. Patio burger, I can see what you're looking at. Normal guns didn't do this. I can show you them." Instant curiosity took over him then, as Patrick took his flashlight back and shined it about. Its beam catching visuals he wished it didn't. More dead bodies. And as he moved it further around in the cavern to try and spot the abnormal guns mentioned, himself not moving by the way of Linus holding him back, a noise started creeping into earshot. Footsteps. No prompting was needed. Patrick shut off the flashlights as the footsteps grew louder as the unknowns approached. When the unknowns were in the same space as they were but a distance off, a very good distance both men felt grateful for. One of the unknowns shouted in the darkness, the one who'd been behind the lead. The one that had, if Patrick's eyes were right in their dim setting, a gun pointed in the back of the other. "Maelstrom, I have a matter which needs to be tended to. Ended." The reply didn't start vocally. It started with the sound of more steps from the unseen. These sounded a little faster, unlike the slower ones taken when people who now could be seen had entered the cavern. Vocally, when it came, it made both Patrick and Linus's hair stand on end. "More than one matter, Hurricane. You weren't followed, I believe, but we aren't alone. I don't think it's the vermin who live around here. They know better than to bring a flashlight to this place." I'm not prepared in the sense it matters, thought Patrick as he got as low to the ground with Linus by his side as he could. The dead body before both of them making it an uncomfortable matter to do. He felt sick with fear, and now knowing who exactly working for Vile was in the cavern with them. He'd encountered Maelstrom before, when he and Jocelyn went around Ontario. He was the leader behind a team in Vile named Storm. The case leading them into encountering the Storm team agents had been dealing with a high-profile theft, which also was stained with some brutally carried-out homicides. Not only was its leader twisted in whatever guided his reasoning, he was also sick in how he liked to kill anyone connected to his works that he didn't want talking. But lastly, what made him all the more worse to be feared, he was very intelligent. He had outsmarted both detectives more than once on that case and in the end escaped their custody when they were convinced they had him cornered with nowhere to go. The malefactor the Acme detective knew was looking for him and his friend. The one Patrick didn't know. He had not wavered from keeping his gun pointed to the back of the other man unknown in front of him. God, the once caramel-brown, now silver-haired man nearly said aloud, the word almost slipping out, with at first wondering how Maelstrom could move about this mess of the area with confidence without the aid of a flashlight of his own, to realizing how he could do it, with the eccentric-looking device fitted over his head and eyes. This made facts click together in his head in a way that made him wish that not only had he had his gun with him, he also wished his partner was here with him, with her gun in her hand. Gunner Maelstrom was using a night vision bear goggles. Only military used those. It was military technology not available to the general public. The abnormal guns had to be military ones. The tremors that shouldn't have been, it was the weapons in use. Both he and Jocelyn were on the same case at that moment, and him entering into it now had been unintentional. One blur of a person named Harper behind himself holding a gun on him. Another blur of a person named Maelstrom at some distance roaming the area for an unknown person or persons in the same space. The muzzle of the gun felt less prominently embedded between his shoulder blades than it had been for some time. Chester suspected why that had to do with Harper's curiosity about Maelstrom's search. Was he ready to pull the trigger on Maelstrom's find if that should happen? While awful for the hidden, it was good for him. Pretending his blurred vision surrounded by near darkness was merely the result of having his eyes shut. The detective working for PBS dropped down, turned, and kicked hard at Harper the Hurricane, forcing him to lose his balance and fall to the ground, letting go of his pistol in the act. The goon, being stunned by the sudden hit and fall, didn't last long, as Chester fell for the gun to try and gain leverage in the situation. Not that he was bent on the idea to hurt the man. What he wanted was not to be in harm's way of him. Answers about what was going on would have been appreciated too, and he felt the criminal wouldn't tell him in reverse circumstance. Harper was fast to move at trying to regain his missing firearm. Locating the gun wasn't easy because of its dark shape among dark shapes. Making out the shape of Harper against them was easier. Beating him to the punch of the direction he was reaching for was a different matter. As the second abductor started to take hold of the gun, Chester hit him in the lower arm of one, making him the reach. The advantage then fell to the detective as he took hold of the gun. A shot was fired, but not by Chester. Maelstrom had decided to turn his attention to the people he could easily locate. The bullet had whizzed by close to each of them. A device used to get their attention was thought on both Harper's and Chester's mind. Then the team leader for Storm had his attention jarred. Knowing the man once thought to be another possible victim now was no longer under threat as he had been. Seeing he needed help to avoid yet another who intended him harm, Patrick plowed into the leader from the side. The knock hadn't sent Maelstrom off balance as it had Hurricane. It only caused him to stumble, and much to Patrick's displeasure, not cause him to lose grip on his gun. "You're slaughtering people down here using military weapons to do the act, aren't you?" Patrick shouted, as the commanding violation took in the sight of him. Gunner Maelstrom smiled at realizing who he had in his presence and more. The Acme Detective Agency had been a thorn in Vile's side for as long as its founding, even longer, he was told. Patrick Gardner was as deeply embedded in that history as the others who worked for Acme. He knew how Gardner worked, and that Gunner knew made him lucky. His other half was missing, and as good as the man was at improvising, that didn't work here. That is, unless the old man made it to what he just said aloud. The stock of the M1 Garand rifles and the 37mm gun M3s. Aiming his gun in hand, he exclaimed, "You weren't alone, and even better without your bag of tricks, friend." Linus knew he was so deeply in danger he didn't know what to do. He decided to stay frozen to where until not long ago both him and Patrick had been on the ground. He knew he should run, but felt helpless. He only wanted to grab Patrick, pull him aside, and get him out of there. But that help was at the mercy of another he considered the devil incarnate after all he knew the man had done, at least all he was aware of. The evidence, the bodies of men and women he'd taken their lives, the mass grave Linus was in, unless Patty's friends came to where they were right then, this was it. More gunfire sounded off, but then not from Maelstrom. The sound echoing around the cavern resulted in a few things. Linus giving the facial expression of one in shock of sudden death. Patrick dropping into a crouch and momentarily wondering who could have fired the shots. Gunner flinching by instinct, but then looking in the right direction to find out where the shots had come from. The gunfire sounded off again. Chester was trying to make sure as Harper tried to grapple with him for the firearm, that his aim while directed towards Maelstrom didn't by mistake hit who else was standing a good distance off. That last shot had thudded into one of the dead bodies. The other shots he'd fired off had hit the roof of the cavern, hit derelict excavating equipment, and lastly, in a sharp-sounding ping, hit against an anti-tank gun. "Hey, other guy, I'm nearly blind down here. Go back to being ducked down and get away. I'll keep this Maelstrom person in check while you get the cops. Don't worry, I'm a detective." Chester shouted in the direction of the duo in danger from the senior Vile agent. Studying the look on the younger detective's face told Maelstrom that he indeed was having vision problems. How he could hold such a job beyond having educated reasoning unless the person normally wore glasses. The thought of a handicapped man could do such a job amused him. The thought also told him, despite the gun in the blind man's hand, he was actually harmless. As Gunner pulled back on the trigger before firing, he wanted to share at least part of his thoughts openly. "He clearly isn't with your agency, Gardner. That makes this only a little less enjoyable." The sound wasn't really what recorded in Chester's mind. It was a jolt of impact, the feel of it, the pain deepening and the deepening in its sensation throughout his body. Where the bullet struck was causing the most of that, but the pain couldn't be solely pinned down to one spot. It radiated throughout his whole midsection and chest, even down to where his legs started. Where it was in him, it couldn't have just been muscle. Feeling with his fingers just below the ribcage on the right side of his body, they pressed gently against the open wound. They felt blood sliding around them, surfacing from broken veins. He didn't want to black out. He'd done that once already today, and that had been by forced matter. This would be forced matter too, he realized, but not like the blow to the head had done. He had to stay awake. Things now he could hear were taking an interesting turn. Seeing the lights entering the cavern would normally send Linus and others he lived with packing in a heartbeat. Unlike when the confrontation started and he'd been spotted, now he didn't feel like a stunned animal not knowing what to do when faced with danger. This time he made sure to get out of the way, of the cutthroats, the detectives, and the ones entering the area. The lights didn't seem interested in spotting him. Their focus was on those he knew, good and evil. Slipping out into the tunnels came easy. He just wished his conscience forgiving him for the act would be more so, but he doubted it. At seeing the intrusion upon the space they and the others affiliated to them had been using to perform both local executions in. Both Storm Team file agents present had the same idea at the same time, to make their way over to stolen high-powered arsenal and fire on the new company, not wanting to put anything to chance of getting shot at. To ensure a thundering barrage of 30-06 Springfield cartridges didn't go blasting off of them, the holders of the copious of lanterns and flashlights were faster on their feet than the other two. As they shot by, Patrick noticed something about them which he didn't see when they were a distance off. Their dress almost looked military in nature, and to top that aside from what looked like non-standard billy clubs, some of them had handcuffs hanging off their belts. As both criminals were tackled and handcuffed, considering pulling one of the newer, now slower-moving men aside, then deciding simple questioning might be better, the Acme detective asked one of the invading force, "Who are you guys?" The one among them that decided to take question, Patrick couldn't be sure because of lighting, that the invader looked pale in the face. Lighting, or him taking in the sight of the mass grave they were standing in, understandable to second explanation the old detective thought, if that were true of the man's expression beyond his faded pigment appearance. Who wouldn't be feeling sick at such a sight, unless they were used to seeing such a thing? Speaking up, the guest's sick man answered, "Not officially here, sir." "Excuse me?" Patrick was confused by the answer, but knew there had to be a good reason it had to be said. He just wished he knew why. After trying to shield his nose from the smell of the cavern's non-living, the man that had just spoken and replied that he wasn't there answered again, but clearing up the earlier comment. "Not officially with Fort Sherman. Reserve ready to serve, but not in service, sir. Off record and not accountable by military law." Jocelyn had put two and two together as well, making that even better at least. Patrick hoped he was right about his guess. He asked, "But you can bring in those two to the custody of law enforcement? Make sure your stolen firepower makes it where it needs to be. Also, not tell the normal operation of the law about people you've seen down here, not vile agents." "What people here besides the ones with vile?" As the reply had come, the Acme employee knew the man had meant the question in jest. Then the unofficial, not present man, pointed towards a spot off in the distance, which was moving slightly with the back against the floor, adding, "Is that man with vile as well?" Taking in a sharp breath at the realization one element in this event had been forgotten about, Patrick shouted, "Not vile, and Lord, I hope not ready for heaven either. Do any of you people have any medical training?" Pain had been consuming most of his focus, that and staying awake. From what he could gather, it seemed like the cavalry had arrived. Confident-sounding new voices questioning the surroundings they were in. They also were drinking and noticing the place was apparently acting as an illegal home to their property. Chester could only take their word for that, but it added up. While he could barely make out his surroundings, he had heard the non-vocal criminal voice speaking of the military weapons being put to use here. Were these men soldiers? He couldn't hear everything being said, and the latest shout from the non-criminal he'd heard. Help for himself was coming, he hoped. He could hear others shouting as well. The cavalry taking charge of handling Hurricane and Maelstrom. Both men complaining about being taken captive. Despite all that was going on, one true lack of an answer about all this bothered him. The fate of Dennis Fannin. The PBS employee had a feeling the answer had been handed to him. When the non-criminal had shouted about the deeds being performed by way of military weapons, Chief Partlow had been right if this was indeed true, and that had been made this investigation worthless. Fannin was dead, as a new sick feeling in his gut told him. The smells to make one sick, surrounding him also, he felt, told the same message. For 2 days, the Partlow, Bumpus, and Sullivan Detective Agency had wondered what had happened to its missing employee. That mystery ended when the middle name returned to work, looking sheepish, and was noticed to be wearing a hospital wristband, IDing him with basic information. Not removing the band had been a very conscious decision. Chester didn't want to hear of his mistake, and he also felt lucky he'd been able to acquire new, if however generic, glasses while in the hospital. His misuse of time, that while not documented in the books for what it had been, of investigating the truth he didn't want to believe in, it had turned into a time misused to the agency when he'd vanished for the days. Docked pay now, and hoping he wouldn't get fired for it. If he had any luck at all, he knew they'd see the band and realize something bad had happened, but wouldn't pin that bad to a working on a case. The wanted luck had come with his chief and Sullivan, but not from Cherry. She didn't speak except once over the matter when seeing the band. The multi-job employee knew it likely connected to what had happened the other day, and she had played a minor role in it.
at least to her thought perspective. The connection for her had clicked together, but she didn't ask the question Chester dreaded answering. Of the case and whatever happened to the subject of it. All she did ask was, "Our acting. Did that do this? Get you hurt? Were the suspected thugs vile?" Answering the questions was something Chester could only bring himself to do after a long pause of sitting at his desk and choosing until speaking to avoid her looking at him. Not directly, and yes, the group file has been confirmed. The day and its hours passing that question continued uneventful. No new cases were presented, and the only work the agency had to deal with was the never-ending flow of paperwork and phone calls it produced. Communication with various police stations and City Hall over processing of their work, the acquiring of permits for investigations not fully taken underway yet due to red tape, the contacting of families and businesses over earlier created investigations recently concluded, plus ones in their initial phases of being put together. It was almost closing time when a knock sounded at the door. Hopefulness at a new opportunity for work was what went through the minds of Partlow and Sullivan. For Sherry, it was a disruption, but her job to handle, greeting whoever wanted the agency's time and showing them to whom they should be working with. Why she considered it a disruption wasn't too common for this time of day. At this time, she'd either be mentally getting ready to leave for home or getting ready to work for Y shift if asked to. Today at 5 p.m., she only wanted to have a long chat with her friend to discover why he'd vanished for 2 days beyond the obvious. For Chester, the knock meant the same as it did to the other 2 official detectives present, with the exception of his heart wasn't in the idea of a new case. Just not then. He needed a little bit of time. The faces of the people Sherry greeted at the door were people she didn't know. Expected. New faces entered the agency on a regular basis. These 2 entering the lobby area with her looked like a married couple, at least she assumed they were. High up in their years, standing side by side as partners tended to do, and also looking very formal for presentation. The secretary/unofficial detective dropped the assumption they were a couple when noticing only one wore a wedding band. The lady was wearing the ring, and by the look of it, had on her, she had started wearing it a long time ago. So that meant the man was a friend or a relative. Taking the initiative to speak after Sherry had verbally welcomed them in, the man spoke. "I understand this is the agency of a Mr. Chester Bumpus works for." A little shocked, he knew off the bat to which of the formal investigative staff he wanted to speak to. Sherry wanted to discount the common reasoning behind how that could have happened. Of a handed-over business card at some point in time, she wanted to think this person more appropriately noted this couple had something to do with Chester's missing time. Answering the man's question, Sherry exclaimed and motioned to the door of Chester's office. "Yes, he's in." Before the pair reached the office door, Sherry had to add, "You have business with him? I mean established business with him?" Patting the door lightly before both he and his lady partner turned to face Sherry, the man answered, "Nothing he'd want to brag about, I'm sure, but Jocelyn and I hope to establish former business with him. I figured it's owed." Chester had heard the conversation beyond the door to his office, and when the pair entered his space, shutting the door behind them, he eyed the couple before commenting to the man, "Sir, while I don't recognize your face, and I'm sure you remember why that is, I do remember your voice." Putting hands at tabletop and leaning in, speaking in a hushed tone, Patrick replied, "And I remember you're firing off a gun like a madman." Not the sort of thing a young detective wanted to think about. The wild firing having not been his goal, but done to instead send a halting warning to the vile agent, who'd been more in command than the one that had held him at a very direct gunpoint. The shots being wild had come from the struggle he'd been facing to keep hold of the gun from Harper. Keeping his eyes fixed on the Acme detective that had just spoken, all Chester could think to do in response was moan. Now the lady leaned into the table, bracing herself with it by only her left hand. Continuing in the same tone as Patrick had, Jocelyn stated, "We're keeping our voices lowered so as to make sure your coworkers can't hear this conversation." "Thank you," was as far as Chester could think to engage into the topic he was sure was still being spoken of. The urge to melt into his chair was what else he wanted to do, but knew that was impossible. "My name is Patrick Gardner. The person who was with me in that subway cavern was Linus Cade. You saved his life with that distraction you caused, and likely mine as well. I am sure you discharging that gun, as much as you did helped in sound, lead those reserve officers to us. Mrs. Jocelyn DeRise and I, we head up a non-official detective agency named Acme. It's a little understaffed right now. Interested?" His brain shutting off hadn't been unintentional. He knew what he was being asked, but that isn't what his mouth decided to do. Question what he just heard. "What?" Lowering into her voice more and giving a look that told Chester more of play than seriousness, Jocelyn, using her right hand, forced him to pay attention to her. Shifting his chin forward, she said, "We'd like to poach you into our agency." He had heard this Mr. Gardner person correctly. Mrs. DeRise had also confirmed it. He'd messed up and then corrected himself, and he'd saved lives, and they knew that. His illy executed action, for which he could easily get reprimanded by his coworkers for, it had helped save the day. No longer wanting to disappear, Chester got up from his desk and chair to give the offer some thought. Yes, he had a job, and he enjoyed it, although he didn't want to feel he was in danger of getting fired anytime soon. But if him disobeying, leaving a case from what had been altered to, working on its first reason to exist only to discover he had been wrong, and being gone for days without being able to say the full explanation without lying, surely taking the job made sense if the worst happened. However, there would be one job aspect he'd miss if he left. Taking a cue from his visitors and knowing this too was a matter better said in hushed tones, Chester asked, "Do ladies get paid nicely at Acme?" "I like to think I do, and the other women in our employ," Jocelyn answered, still keeping her voice low, unsure how to take the question from him. While the two Acme detectives exchanged looks, Chester opened the door to his office, and then motioning with a finger of hooking it inwards a few times towards himself, he used it to prompt his friend as he spoke. "Sherry, could you come in here?" Doing as her friend had prompted, Sherry entered his office and shut the door behind herself. As the group spoke out of sight from the other employees, curious to know what was taking place, quieted voices not helping their intrigue and ever-prying nature. All they got of the four-way conversation before leaving for the day was a shout from the older man, exclaiming him and the lady he'd come in with were going to be getting a ceiling fan, followed by the older lady simply saying his name sharply before soft speaking continued again. The end.